Hi, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday's experiment and exploration in media art and other kinds of art. Um, we're heading into the final weeks of this Wednesday series, and next Wednesday on April 11th, the Oakland-based collective, The Black Aesthetic, is going to be here to talk about their work and the idea and practices of experimental art within the Black aesthetic. So please come next Wednesday. Uh, this week we have with us the Greg Sholette art action figure, who has beamed in from New York City, and he arrived last night in a box. I opened it, and inside there was a seemingly genteel artist type, slightly bohemian looking, with a nicely trimmed beard, wearing a tweed sport jacket. Only the wrestling shoes belie his true nature. In an instant, he removed his coat and unpacked his artist action toolbox, and things, as you will see, begin to happen. Sholette's toolbox comes with the requisite brushes, chisels, as well as self-annotated box-size editions of Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, and the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film. The kit includes Sholette's own multimedia artworks, combining elements of sculpture, and you can see the action figure there on the screen. It includes multimedia artworks combining elements of sculpture, photography, drawings, and text, as well as copies of his writings on the history and theories of contemporary arts activisms that inform all of his work. The Sholette kit reflects 20 years or more of experience in cultural organizing that has created some of the most innovative artist collectives of the last 2 decades. These, along with his activities as an author, exhibition curator, college educator, professional toy model builder, and public intellectually, tirelessly speaking for alternative relationships between art practice and the public sphere, has made Greg Sholette a paradigmatic figure in today's post-studio artist. In both theory and practice, Greg has been one of the foremost experimenters, exploring questions about the relationship between art and politics and the possibilities of social critique and resistance through art making. As an activist, he's been part of a whole range of projects, both within traditional art venues and out on the streets. He was a founding member of the Political Art Documentation Distribution group in New York, which issued publications on politically engaged art during the 80s and 90s. The artist collective REPOhistory, which repossessed suppressed histories in New York and elsewhere, turning them into public art. And more recently, the Gulf Labor Project is a group of artists advocating for migrant workers, constructing museums, or building the museums in Abu Dhabi. And I think he'll talk about these projects more in his talk. As a writer and theorist, he's written dozens of essays, edited 3 volumes, as well as his own books, which include Dark Matter, Art and Politics in the Age of Enterprise Culture from 2011. And in each of these, he's documented the last 40 years of activist art for its ephemerality, politics, and market resistance. And all of these these projects might otherwise remain invisible. He's contributed to many journals, including Critical Inquiry, Text zu Kunst, October, the CAA Art Journal, and the list goes on. His recent art installations include the Imaginary Archive at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania, and the White Box at Zeppelin University in Germany. His collaborative performance, Precarious Workers Pageant, premiered in Venice in 2015. Greg holds an MFA from the University of San Diego and a PhD from the University of Amsterdam, and is currently associate professor at Queens College in the art department, where he has established a new MFA concentration in social practice. So there's a lot here in this action figure, and join me in welcoming Greg Sholette to Berkeley.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I don't think I have to do anything else. You've done so much. I am actually going to cover some of the things that my good friend talked about in a whirlwind of imagery and historical materials and ideas, mostly because something Jeff said is really important, this idea that a lot of this would disappear and become invisible, because it is largely invisible within academia and within art history. I'm happy to say that's beginning to change, but when I started working on writing about these projects, it really was like hard to find serious scholarly work on a lot of the things I'll show you. So I'm going to kind of go rather quickly. I'll take a couple breathers. If you have a question or a clarification, just get your hand up. I'll grab it as we go, okay? But I hope we can have a conversation. I had landed from Philadelphia in New York City on the Lower East Side of New York City in 1977, and this really literally is what parts of that neighborhood looked like. It had been years of really serious recessions, actually 2 recessions. In 75, the city had almost gone bankrupt, incredible infrastructure problems, the subways weren't working, and so on and so forth. And it was really just at the point where the idea of financialization taking over the city, bringing about austerity programs that would tighten up on labor unions, tighten up on public services, and try to bring fiscal, stability to the city, so to speak. But in a way, it was kind of like a Faustian bargain with the banks and with the financial institutions, with the insurance institutions, sometimes known as FIRE, fire, insurance, and real estate. Basically, that Faustian bargain is now coming due, and I'm sure that you have many similar issues here in the Bay Area, because we can just about not afford to live in New York City anymore because of the pricing. But we'll talk about that a little more. Maybe we can actually have some Q&A on it. This was the famous moment that the acting president basically said he wasn't going to bail out the city. They bailed it out once the banks got on board and said they were going to take care of things. And they certainly did. They sort of pushed out blue-collar workers and so on and so forth. But when I arrived as a young art student, one of the things I realized was there's this whole history of activism that I knew nothing about. Again, that I had not studied as an art student in Pennsylvania. And that included Art Workers Coalition, a group of artists who at one point invaded the Guggenheim Museum to protest the closing of someone's exhibition, who happened to be my professor in New York, Hans Hake. They did a conga line right down the famous ramps, the Frank Lloyd Wright ramps, protesting this. They did protests outside of exhibitions, basically against the Vietnam War, talking about the connection between high culture, art museums, high art, and labor practices, militarization, war, and so forth. We're exactly in that same position today. But the groups that were closer to me in New York City were like this. One's protesting already in 1980 issues around real estate speculation, such as the Real Estate Show, which was an illegally squatted exhibition. And it's a whole story in itself, but needless to say, it was an exciting and interesting moment. The group Material, another group of young artists who were doing work illegally in the street here, protesting various things, literally putting these signs up at night, and then walking around with lab coats and sort of like clipboards, getting people's opinions on the sidewalk, right? Pretending to be authorities. You might realize something else here is that New York was a kind of permeable space at the time, much more permeable. You were able to do things like this. If you've been to New York, I can tell you where this was. This was 14th Street, Union Square. So some of you who've been there will say, oh my God, you're kidding me. Right? They also did projects in the subways. Yes, this is what the subway system looked like at the time. If you need a little further clarification, watch the film The Warriors. Anybody watch it? Okay. All right, that's your homework. There may be other things coming. These were pieces that were done literally in the advertising space of the subway because it was so cheap. No businesses really cared to advertise there. So this group of artists took over these various spaces and did various kinds of projects. And this was another project called Carnival Knowledge, where they taught young women about sexuality, birth control. This is actually a tap dance that explains various birth control techniques. This is circa 1982, Carnival Knowledge. The group that I belonged to was maybe a little bit more politically serious, better and worse, political art documentation distribution, as Jeffrey mentioned. We just say PAD, P-A-D-D. And we had a newspaper. Like, we literally did too many things. We had a newspaper. We created artwork for demonstrations, marching down the street, this inflatable Uncle Sam Pac-Man. That dates the group, of course, already. Pac-Man, what would it be today? Some kind of app, I guess. Emoji, I don't know. We also had the newsletter that talked about issues around real estate and gentrification, including the cover of this. I want to drill down just a little here because the subgroup that I was part of in PADD was a reading group that then became active trying to oppose gentrification. So just to give a sense of it, this was the headline of an article in the Village Voice, then a very prominent newspaper in New York. And so in 1983, we decided to do an enormous exhibition protesting the real estate development and speculation on the Lower East Side. Now, that would be the area east of 2nd Avenue, 1st Avenue, south of 14th Street. A lot of it was landfill. A lot of it was built in the late 19th century for immigrant communities, Italians, Jews, others who were coming to work in various sweatshops, etc. The area was becoming rapidly artified, like lots of galleries were popping up, and younger people from the suburbs, including myself, mostly white, kind of moving in, and they were sort of pushing the rents up for the working class people there, who were very, very mixed culturally, but by and large, mostly Latino, mostly Dominican and Puerto Rican. We did this project at a space called Charas, which was a Puerto Rican kind of community center. We did this huge exhibition. And Jeff, were you in that show? I don't remember. Yeah, Jeff was. Just like we put all these works in there, we built these galleries. The next day in the New York Times, someone reviews it and says, oh yeah, they're pioneering in new territories. And we're like, wait a minute, that's exactly what we were trying to avoid, getting in the New York Times and talking about expanding into this area. So we rethought the problem. And the next year we decided we're going to target the art community itself. And we decided to do a project that specifically talked about the way galleries were popping up in the neighborhood and creating this kind of cycle of displacement. So what you see are 4 galleries that we invented. 4 galleries that we invented. This is the poster for the exhibition, including the Discount Salon. And another gallery. Graffiti art was making its way into the art world vis-a-vis the art scene here in the 1980s on the Lower East Side. So we did a graffiti-style gallery. Leona Helmsley, who was later arrested for tax fraud, she was a huge real estate developer. And this was actually on the Christadora building. So if anybody remembers New York in those days, it was a burnout building. And then the Guggenheim downtown. I mean, there was no Guggenheim downtown at the time. It wasn't really conceivable. And yet our idea was that sure enough, after a while, these things would actually take place. We had artists create all kinds of works, including stencils. And I think you get the reference here to Picasso's Guernica. These went right on the street. Other projects that directly address this imagery that the real estate agencies were using to talk about this sort of young, mostly white people moving in, wealthier people, as sort of pioneers or as cowboys, taming the residents, taming the sort of wild Indians, whatever, in the area. And works that literally talked about how to rebuild for yourself, or quite humorously, this piece, which at the time, you get the joke, it was like a large silkscreen like this. We thought that that's an incredible amount of money to pay for an apartment in New York City at the time. $1,400, nobody could conceive of it in 1984. Today, that would be peanuts in the same neighborhood. Needless to say, our project, and this was the opening for it, did not succeed in stopping gentrification. We may have we may have actually helped accelerate it, who knows. This was the opening. It was on a street corner. And I told you we created 4 galleries, but these weren't actually galleries. These were literally street corners, buildings that had been boarded up, that we slapped these artworks up in the street. So they were fake galleries, and they were talking about a real situation. Eventually, the galleries themselves got gentrified out of the neighborhood. They couldn't stay there, and they moved elsewhere, and so on and so forth. The cycle, which you may know, or if you don't, we can talk about in more detail. And that was kind of towards the end of PADD. Sometime around 1988, we just kind of lost air, lost steam. And as collectives go, we kind of collapsed. But not before we kind of gave birth to another collective, one in which we attempted to show the way history can disturb the present. Its name was derived largely from this film. This is the other part of your homework. If you haven't seen Repo Man, you have to see it, because we called the group REPOhistory. Now, repo men and repo women are kind of scurrilous people. They come around and they take back property that hasn't been fully paid for, mostly from working people. We all know this. Our idea was we would be the repo men and repo women who would actually steal back histories that had been forgotten or overlooked or suppressed and put them back in the streets where they belonged. And I'm very happy to say that there's 2 REPOhistory members here with me tonight, Betty Sue Hertz, and also Jeffrey Scholar himself, who created a work for the early projects, and Betty Sue went on to do quite a few projects. But just to give you an example, okay, Stuart Davis. Out of curiosity, does anybody know who Stuart Davis was? Any art historians? Yes. Usually I get no answers. Stuart Davis, just to give you a sense of it, is a painter kind of known for his abstraction, mostly the abstraction paintings he did in the 1920s and 30s, had a long career. And around 13th Street in Manhattan, there's an apartment building, co-op building, and they've put this plaque up. This is not an official city plaque. This happens to be on a private building. And it says, Stuart Davis lived here. He had a studio here. He was influenced by jazz, this and that, and the other thing. It's all fine. What it doesn't say is that Stuart Davis was one of the principal theorists of the American Communist Party when it came to ideas of culture. This is the kind of histories, this is the kind of missing parts of the past and the archive that we wanted to sort of address. How did we do it? And this is usually an entire lecture in itself, so I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. But again, I'm happy to go back and bring in some of the details if you ask me afterwards. We literally decided we would create metal street signs. Rather simple idea. Street signs that you might see telling you where to park your car or where not to cross the street or whatever, with the idea that we could borrow the authority of them to some degree and kind of queer them in a way, like kind of undermine them and do something that wasn't expected. So we basically had them printed on both sides of metal plaques, just like real street signs. And text was usually on one side, images was on the other, where there were numbers because we created a map and it told you where to look for them, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then we got permission, and that itself is a long story, but we managed to get permission from the city, from the Department of Transportation, to put these up in public. Today, that would probably be almost impossible. We literally put them up ourselves to save money, but we had the permits to do it. And we did things like mark the first meal and slave market in New York, which was right near Wall Street, right near the stock exchange. And this piece by Mark O'Brien and Tess Timoney. So different individuals created different signs, sometimes groups of individuals, sometimes collaborations, and submitted them to the group, and we created them and put them in the street for 1 year. We only had permits to keep them up 1 year. Had we wanted to make this a permanent remapping of the history of New York, we would have had to go through many, many permits, and almost certainly we would have been stopped because several of the pieces in the project later were actually questioned. Later, we did several other projects. This was from a 1998 project. This was the first woman to become a firefighter in New York City. The sign was created by Susan Shupley, who's an artist and theorist who's now in London. Just to give you a flavor of what we're doing, and it would look something like this. Back again to 1992, and I should mention we chose 1992 for the first project because it coincided with the Columbus quincentennial, which was 500 years since Columbus had, quote, discovered the New World, and of course brought all kinds of misery to people. This piece by Jim Costanzo, who now goes by the pseudonym or the Aaron Burson Society, I recommend you look it up, was posted right outside the stock exchange. Advantages of an unregulated free market economy. It talks about what we today describe as neoliberalism, or the ultra-free market economy, the deregulated economy. One of the interesting notes was it also happened to be the anniversary, the 200th anniversary of the stock exchange, where we put this up. You see the blue flyers, the blue banners. The stock exchange called up the Department of Transportation and said, you know, you have to take this sign down, criticizing capitalism, criticizing stock exchange, etc. And it was wonderful. The person that was in office there, a guy by the name of Frank Audio, said, no, they have a permit. They get to keep it up. And it was like, oh, you know, it was amazing. I mean, it was really great. We created a map for every one of these projects. This is the first one from '92, so that you could do your own walking tours. Those little red dots were where the various signs were located. And what we discovered was actually it was still hard to find signs because New York City is so visually busy that you could walk around and not even see something that's right there. But not a single sign was removed, or I think one was removed and put right back up again. Nothing was tagged. It was very interesting in 1992. And the city made it REPOhistory Day when we opened the project. Under the first and only African-American mayor, we had David Dinkins. We got press, but we didn't really get much art press. We got more mainstream press, interestingly enough. We also somehow managed, I don't know how we did it, had the energy to do another project about the history of abortion and abortificants and the way women have controlled their own sexuality and reproduction, which was at a space called Artist Space in New York. And so we were really kind of out of the barrel of the cannon, just like rocking in 1992, crazy. In '98, we did another street project, and this time, things had shifted. David Dinkins, the progressive liberal, was no longer a mayor. We now had Rudolph Giuliani, former prosecutor, law and order guy, city of order, right? We went through all the same processes we had before to try to get permits, did exactly the same thing, and then all of a sudden we got stopped at the last minute. We're told, you don't have a permit. They faxed us this information. So we literally had the signs made. We had ladders. We had everything ready to go. And boom, that was like, okay, no go. Now, this may have been one of the problems. This piece by David Thorne and Jenny Pollock from 1994 to 96, 75 people were killed, shot in back, shot in head, pinned face down and shot, choked, hogtied, and crushed, beaten to death by New York City police officers. Only 3 officers were convicted of committing any crimes, 0 for murder. Now, this is 1998. One of the victims' fathers, Mr. Hayward, whose son was shot while playing in a housing project with a toy gun, liked this project so much he knew about it, and we intended to put a sign outside of his housing project, got a copy of it, put it in his car. He also had a graph mural of his son made by someone else. As I said, we were out in the street, ready to rock. We were told we couldn't do it. We then had to threaten to sue the city. And we were working with a group of lawyers, and we had a very big law firm, Debevoise Plimpton, which said, we'll do this for free. This is when Rudolph Giuliani's popularity was very low. And so they were happy to join forces with us to critique him. Finally, the city gave in. They realized they had too many precedents on our side. There was nothing they could do. And so they let us put the sign project up. Here we are installing it outside of Anthony Baez's house, his mother, Mrs. Baez, in the window in the Bronx. Her son was playing, and you see another graph mural, was playing touch football outside the house. The ball bounced off a car, stopped, the car stops. Turns out it's an off-duty police officer who steps out, puts him in a chokehold, and kills him. The police said he had cocaine in his body and so on and so forth. Of course, when the autopsy was done, there was nothing, right? And again, she sued the city and got nothing. I think she may exactly got a settlement, but there was nothing done to the officer at the time. So we got the project up, including here criticizing the Empire State Building for not having access for disabled people. Then we discovered that the Empire State Building came along, the maintenance people, and they took the sign down. We put it back up. We had multiple copies. They took it down again. We put it back up. One of them finally confronted the people putting it up, our group, and said, you know, we're just going to take it down as soon as you leave. So it turns out, interestingly, in public space, particularly in urban space, you think if you have a permit, it's actually you are in control because you have that right. But no, big institutions near like near the Empire State Building and others feel that they control the space around what they do. Um, we made another map for the project. This is the one in 1998. And this project was called Civil Disturbances, Battles for Justice in New York City because it talked about the way the law was used as an activist medium to bring about social and economic equality. We distributed the maps where people went to do jury duty so they could actually do a walking tour of these projects. And again, we got a bit of press, some of it negative on the right in the Post about precisely some of the projects that we had put up. There were other projects, one in between called Queer Spaces, which Betty Sue actually had a big hand in working on. And Queer Spaces was done with the Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is an alternative space in New York. And it marked, I think it was 9 sites of gay and lesbian history, transgendered history. This one had to do with a very famous lesbian bar that was in New York that was no longer there. The one I just want to focus on for a second had to do with Marsha Johnson. Marsha Johnson was a transgendered activist who worked in the meatpacking district of New York, which is like way on the west side below 14th Street, or just above 14th Street, actually, sorry. A couple things I want to point out, and I'll go through it. First of all, Marsha Johnson just had a documentary come out about her, which you can find online, and there is a brief shot of the sign we created for her, and she was a political activist in many respects. The sign is here, located in this area of New York. It talks about the fact that she was found floating dead in the Hudson, and this was just a couple years before we put the project up in 2004. Almost certainly a victim of gay bashing, even though the police said she had committed suicide. Other transgendered people, her friends, said, no, that would be very unlike her. So in a sense, our sign became a kind of memorial to this person. Just to give you a location, this is the area in New York City. This is what it looked like, not quite at that time, but in that general time, maybe before that a little bit, leading up to the 1990s. Transgender prostitutes working the streets, runaway kids, lots of people doing activism and other kinds of things. This is what it looked like a long time ago when it was actually mostly tanneries and meat shops. I mean, because it is called the meatpacking district, not for nothing. So I want to show you, though, what it looks like today. And some of you probably have visited this area. It's now this very sort of fancy place called the High Line, which is above this area, right, literally above it, and has completely transformed the real estate in that region. You see the new Whitney Museum in the background there. Stores, of course, like this. And 2 points I want to make. One is that this whole other history of that area, which we marked, it turns out we marked at just the moment that it was about to disappear, virtually disappear. Right? The other thing that's interesting is I told you we only had 1-year permits for these projects. And so when people went to take this sign down, which we had to do at the end of the year, there were other transgender activists who came along and said, wait a minute, you can't take that, that's ours. And instead of taking it down, people walked away, our group walked away and just left it there as a memorial to this person. Of course, it's disappeared since then. Who knows where the sign went? The entire area, as I said, has been radically transformed. It's a different city. It's almost as if another city slid underneath the other one and has kind of vanished, murmuring from underneath like an archive, right? REPOhistory inspired other people to do projects, including this project in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they literally made their signs look like official history markers. You see it here on the left. And this is the Howling Mob Society. They created a wonderful website, which still should be up and running, where you could find all of the markers. They literally went out, though, and put these up illegally, which was initially what REPOhistory was going to do, a guerrilla project. And they put them up in the streets. And because they looked so official, for the most part, people didn't even detect what they were. What they were marking, though, was an incredible historical moment in Pittsburgh that spread across the United States at the end of the 19th century when railroad workers went on strike and just about created a general strike across the US. They certainly had one in Pittsburgh. That's why the strikers were called the Howling Mob, and this is why they called themselves the Howling Mob Society. Another project that's closer to home was created by Jeremy Deller, David Hillard, who you may know is with the Black Panther Party, and the Center for Tactical Media, which is located here on the West Coast, aka Aaron Gatch. Why this sign on this lamppost? This is in Oakland. This lamppost was put in place literally by the activism of the Black Panther Party. How? On one side of the street that this marks was a Black community, and the kids had to cross a very busy and dangerous intersection to get to school. No matter how often the African American community asked the largely white city council, please, can you put a traffic light in? They refused, until the Black Panthers, dressed in full regalia, decided to become crossing guards. And they stopped the traffic and brought the kids across the street. That spectacle forced the city council to put that lamppost in, and that's what this sign marks. This is from about 2000. Or Poco Society, a masked guerrilla underground project in the UC San Diego area that literally puts plaques around talking about the Latino history of the region illegally. Just a last note, I had thought that all of our REPOhistory signs had been taken down, had vanished. And just a few years ago, a former student of mine was walking around, and it was Mr. Hayward's neighborhood, the man who had lost his son to the shooting, and discovered that the sign was still there. Again, obviously protected by Mr. Hayward, a bit beat up, but in this housing project. So I want to shift gears just a second and throw a couple ideas at you that we can maybe work with. First of all, the first group that I talked about, political art documentation, distribution, created this sort of impressive archive of political art. Now, that was really kind of an amateur project. Nobody really knew how to do archiving. It was like literally little postcards. But where did it end up? It ended up at the Museum of Modern Art, here. Now that's a bit strange, because the archive was meant to be about art that opposed the mainstream art world, that was about politics, that was about socially engaged work. What does the Museum of Modern Art gain from having an archive like this in its bowels, you might say? What does this history tell us? That is it there to be forgotten? This was the problem that I faced after having done these projects with REPOhistory, with PAD, and starting to think, why is none of this showing up in my art history books? Why is none of this being recorded? There was an interesting theorist from New York, Craig Owens, who died of causes related to AIDS. And after he died, he had never written a whole book, but they collected his work in a volume. And this is like around, I found this book, I'm going to say it's like 2005, 2004, something like that. And I remembered that one of the essays he wrote, one very well-known essay in Art in America, talked about PADD, talked about that PAD group, talked about the anti-gentrification show that we did that I showed you a minute ago. It was a two-page piece. It was a very powerful piece. It made the link between artists and culture and gentrification and displacement, and it used imagery from our show to illustrate the piece. I picked up the book, paged through it, went to the index. PADD was listed. Great. I flipped to the page, and all the work was gone. There were no images left. Okay, maybe they couldn't afford the image. Maybe they couldn't find us to get permission. Who knows what the reason was. But then I realized that even the text itself had been edited to excise this group, PADD, from the history. Right? We just fell into the cracks. That's what it looks like in the book. This is what it looked like in the magazine. Again. So I began to think about this idea of history as this kind of, art history as this kind of thing that is just filled, yeah, it's going a little faster than I wanted, but, and I started to think, what happens to all this work? Some of you will know the reference here. And now I want to talk about something that I call sort of dark matter, which is to say that I began to look at all of these histories as a kind of missing mass within art history. And part of my inspiration was this quote from a friend of mine and a very important feminist art historian. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the wrong quote. I apologize. Carol Duncan, who I was going to reference, who talked about the fact that the art world is replete with way many people and artists and creativity that can ever afford to sustain. And what I began to realize is that, in a sense, that's a necessary component of what the art world is about. But something's been happening, and that's taken place largely since the internet has become available and other factors that has allowed this sort of missing mass to become more and more visible. We can think about it in two ways. We can think about it as an underground economy. So, for example, and this is a very rough approximation, you can see that the country Peru, more than half of its economy is literally informal and underground and sustains the entire economy. So we might think about what goes on in a cultural sphere like the art world, where most of the people who are producing work are actually helping to sustain the entire production of art, but are mostly informally doing so, mostly invisible and doing it informally. What do I mean by informally? They may be exchanging work, they may be gifting things to each other, they're sharing ideas, and yet they're still buying art supplies, buying memberships in museums, doing all the things that other people are doing. A second way to look at this, and the one that I finally settled on to talk about it, was this concept of dark matter. And as some of you probably know, if you've read anything about astrophysics, dark matter is essentially like the big unknown of what keeps the universe from flying apart. According to standard theory, the universe started as an infinitesimal point, it expanded very rapidly, and the question is, why didn't it keep expanding forever? Why didn't it just become one big, cold nothing? How did it form stars? How did it form galaxies? How did it form planets? There must be enough gravitation, there must be enough mass and energy to keep it from doing that, except the big problem is visible astronomy has not found enough mass to even come close to that possibility. In fact, only about 6% of the mass in the universe is visible. Scientists have decided, well, the rest of it, let's just call it dark matter. Okay? Now, the big difference here is that if dark matter is what holds the universe together, scientists are scrambling to figure out what it is. If artistic dark matter is what holds the art world together, most people don't care. They just want things to go on as they have. Right? So this is a problem that I began to investigate with the book Dark Matter, and I've continued to do so. Let's just give you a few examples of it. All right? One of them is informal artists, but also artists working at the very margins of art. I don't know if these were artists or not doing knit activism in Dallas area, but these are definitely amateur artists, of which there are thousands and thousands, perhaps even millions maybe, creating work that's now online and made visible by this. One of the ones I love is the amateur archaeologists who have gone to Tunisia to look for the remnants of Tatooine, right, from Star Wars, because that's where Lucas shot the movie, and bits and pieces of the props are still sitting in the desert. And that would all be like a very strange occupation at any time. But with the internet, you can begin to connect with other people and turn it into a whole possibility, perhaps a whole community. People who rebel against their working conditions and create zines. People who make their own sort of amateur versions of their favorite movies, right? Fan movies. People who use the internet to sell their art and avoid art galleries, basically sidestepping the whole process of validation that we think of in the art world. And people who get together and create things like this mobile sewing, cooking, information shop in Baltimore, where you could stop by on the street and just learn techniques, get information about housing and other sort of processes. LARPs, live action role play. When I read about LARPs, I'm like thinking, maybe the art world is just a LARP. You know, we'd all like to keep convincing ourselves that we actually are doing something really significant, historically significant, but it's really just a live action role play game that we're playing. People who do impromptu artwork for demonstrations. This group from Spain, who I don't know if really they're artists, but they're flamenco dancers, and they went into the banks in Spain after the crisis in 2007, 2008, and just started doing dancing in the middle of the banks. Floor 8x7. And this trickled back into the art world because it's another important aspect of dark matter. not just people doing activist work or the great vast number of people who are not respected as artists and do all kinds of creative work. There's also the many pre-failed artists, aka art students. Most people doing an MFA, doing a BFA, the chance that they're going to succeed and become visible in the art world is very, very, very small. What they will do, if they continue to make art, which many do not, is they may end up fabricating the artwork of successful artists, or they may end up running their galleries, or they may end up shuttling the work around between galleries, or installing artworks, or maybe becoming an administrator. Or maybe they'll become like me and get really lucky and have a full-time job where I teach other people to be pre-failed artists. A project that was at the last Whitney Biennial in New York was this project by Occupy Museums and Occupy Debt, where they, in a sense, tried to illustrate my idea of dark matter a bit by literally asking many, many, many artists who would never have been in this biennial, which is a very prestigious biennial, highly curated. You don't get in unless you certainly don't get in if you don't have a gallery. People submitted their artwork to this group because they had been invited to the biennial. But then they put it behind the wall as if you tore the wall away and discovered all of this art that literally is supporting the art world invisibly behind the scenes. I mean, they literally illustrated this idea of dark matter. They also talked and linked it brilliantly beyond what I had done to student debt, to the staggering student debt that many artists carry over after they've gotten their MFAs. It was a brilliant project. They did performance works at the opening, critiquing the board of directors of the Museum of Modern Art and also the Whitney, although they shied a little bit away from the Whitney, which probably was what they had to do. And this really kind of brings me up to the last section of what I want to talk about, which is direct intervention. And here they are talking about Larry Fink, who is on the board of the Museum of Modern Art, but he's also on the board of BlackRock, one of the largest, if not the largest holder of debt in general, including student debt in the world. Because it's one thing for these museums to have political concerns about LGBT rights, Black Lives Matter, putting on shows against wars, against, for progressive causes. It's another thing for them to look at their own finances and also institutions, right? Look at their own finances, look at the money, follow the money, who's on the board, and ask the question, well, it's fine to have the content over here, but what if we address the structural issues that really support that? So we have to sort of think about ways of decolonizing these spaces. And this, I took a shot of this from an intervention at the Brooklyn Museum by Decolonize This Place. A little segue. Social practice art, of which, by the way, if you're interested, the program Jeffrey mentioned, I have some brochures for up here. Please feel free to come up and get them. Also, a free political zine that I created. A book that's about to come out that's talking about this. Social practice art has emerged just in the last maybe 12 years as a kind of concept in itself, maybe 15 years. Certainly there's been community-based art, community education programs, lots of things that preceded it. It's a long discussion. But this idea that there should be something that the art world actually concerns itself with that goes beyond the gallery, goes beyond the museum is an intriguing one. And it often has to do with food. I don't know why. But Mike Rakowitz, who does a whole project around, he's an Iraqi-born artist, does a whole project around food that Iraqis eat, of course, while we were engaged in military maneuvers in Iraq. Enemy Kitchen is the name of this. Or Conflict Kitchen, which is in Pittsburgh, where they purposely serve menus of countries that are at odds with the United States. They even have a Yelp sign. Intriguingly enough, their staff, which is like 22 the last time I checked, recently unionized, which raises all kinds of interesting questions about if it's an artwork, then are the people in the kitchen making the food artworks? And if they're artworks, then why do they need to unionize? And we could kind of extrapolate. Marina Naprishkina, who's in Berlin doing a project where she's literally taken over a large space. I think it's almost this size if you put it all together, an old bowling alley, and turned it into a community refugee center for people who are fleeing the Middle East, the economic and the war in Syria and so on and so forth, and going to Germany. And she's giving them free advice, gets lawyers there to give them free legal advice. They learn German. They also learn Arabic. Some people don't speak Arabic. They do food. And there's Marina. She calls this an artificial institution. Now, what's interesting about it is it's not a legal institution. It's not what we would call an NGO, or here we would call a 501c3 corporation. It's just an artwork, which means that she can get to do things that legal institutions could never get to do. I'll elaborate that in my last section here, which has to do with who builds your architecture. But to do this, I want to take a little bit of a step forward, ask the question, what is the avant-garde today? Is it a car? And backwards, to a moment when the avant-garde, during the early parts of the Russian Revolution, really tried to think about the way art should dissolve into the everyday, right? The streets shall be our brushes, the squares are pals, Mayakovsky. And they created all kinds of works, things that just like, okay, imagine the country's at war, right? They're in a civil war. They've just had a revolution. There's a famine going on. There's no materials. There's nothing. And their artists are building these absolutely mind-blowing utopian projects, like loudspeakers that you carry through the streets to talk about what's going on at the front, right? Or an enormous tower that Tatlin, the artist Tatlin, imagined building to house the Communist Party. A lot of it had to do with geometric shapes, releasing themselves from the idea of representation, had to do with formal concerns built into the real world in a kind of objective way. That whole language of abstraction of the avant-garde is with us still in so many ways, and yet today we can see it has been completely flipped around, not just as a car, but also, for example, this, which is the model for a new Guggenheim that's proposed for Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates by Frank Gehry. That is, of course, the vocabulary of the avant-garde, for geometric shapes and so on and so forth. This thing would be, if it gets built, enormous, like the largest Guggenheim ever. This is what it would look like, artist representation on the edge of this island called Sajiat Island. And Sajiat Island in Arabic means island of happiness. The problem is most of the people that work on Sajiat Island are far from happy. Cartoon by Pablo Helguera. This is just a comic break. Sajiat Island, I visited it a number of years ago. It's literally a desert island off the coast of Abu Dhabi, which is in the Emirates, which, as you know, is a series of kingdoms. They already have a New York University there, which has caused a lot of controversy and problems. But the idea is they want to terraform this desert island into high-end real estate for the very, very wealthy, not even the 1%, like the 0.01%. So they can go to school there, go to NYU, they can go to the most fabulous museums, and there'll be golfing, and there'll be all of the kind of things you would expect, completely sort of transforming this place. Here's kind of where it's located. You might be interested to know that I snapped this picture in the offices of the Guggenheim. It's kind of like Dr. No or something, right? They have points wherever they've been planning to sort of locate a Guggenheim. They have a Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain. They tried to put one in Stockholm. They've had plans for Guggenheims all over the place. So this is not a new situation. But the one in Abu Dhabi drew our attention. And when I say our attention, I mean this group Gulf Labor Coalition, which is a group of international artists. Most of us are centered somewhere in New York or come through New York. But a group of international artists, some of them, a number of them from the Middle East, who said, we're going to boycott this new museum. We're going to boycott the museum because it's not an island of happiness. It's a space of exploitation for migrant workers. Migrant workers come from Bangladesh. They come from India. Some come from Egypt. They come from Philippines. And they go to work there, of course, to make money to send back to their families. But they're recruited by people who charge them enormous amounts of money for the visas. And they discover when they get there, not only are they making less money than they expected in many cases, not only are the housing conditions incredibly worse than they were promised, their passports are taken from them, and they have to spend sometimes 2 or 3 years paying back the visa fee, the recruitment fee, before they can even begin sending money to their family. It's known as the kafala system. And it's not just in Abu Dhabi, it's not just in the Emirates, in the region. We said, as artists, contemporary artists associated with such places as the Guggenheim, if you're going to build a Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, build it to the great standards of, the best standards you can in the West or in Europe. Build it with fair labor practices as much as you can possibly do. Become a model for the region, right? Chase out the kafala system by being a kind of beacon. Right? The Guggenheim, we met with them. We went to their offices. That's where I took the picture. Yes, we believe, we agree with you, of course. I mean, they're good liberals. They absolutely believe this, but we can't do anything. It's the Emirates that controls everything. Oh, really? You're not selling them your brand? Well, we're working on it. We can't do anything more than that. On and on this went. Now, just a few months ago, the Louvre from Paris opened its own new museum. This is under construction, excuse me. Sorry, some of this time. That just opened. I don't know anybody that's been there yet. Maybe someone here has and can tell us about it. But the Guggenheim hasn't been built, which I'll come back to in a second. We met with them, we discussed with them, we negotiated with them, we called the boycott, which they got very upset about. It was in the New York Times, it was a big deal. Again, because a lot of the artists in our group were people they wanted to collect for the new Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. We visited, we got to see the sort of ideal workers' housing, which is this. It looks kind of like a wonderful concentration camp, basically, in the middle of the desert. The workers, really, if they wanted to go anywhere, they couldn't. I mean, they're literally in the middle of a desert, and Abu Dhabi itself, the city, is very far away. But, nice concentration camp. The problem is people who subcontracted from the organization and subcontracted, the conditions were worse and worse and worse. So after we didn't get results, we decided to launch a project called 52 Weeks of Gulf Labor. Every week, we would create an artwork, put it up online or elsewhere to challenge the Guggenheim, to shame them into doing the right thing. Lots of projects happen. One of them I will come back to just at the very end. I did want to show you one that I worked on with my colleague, Matt Greco. Now, I took these pictures of this housing around Christmas, Hanukkah. The Guggenheim in New York comes out with its cute little tchotchke of the Frank Lloyd Wright building. You can buy these, you can put them on your trees, on your bushes, $20. They put these in the gift shop. What we decided to do was come up with our own gift shop item, and using that photograph and schematics that we found online, we 3D printed the workers' housing. We then made a little graphic talking about all of the things I was just telling you about the kafala system and about the Guggenheim in the region. And then we took a whole bunch of these down to the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the flagship of the whole system, and we dropped them, which is the opposite of shoplifting. Now here's the thing. Somebody went there like 3 or 4 days later and told us, your things are still there. So obviously the people in the shop either thought this was a legitimate gift item or were sympathetic perhaps to what we were doing. And probably they sold some of them because we actually transposed the UPC label onto it. That was one of a number of projects that were done to shame the museum. Another one was the Illuminators, which is a group that has a truck, big-ass truck, with a huge, gigantic projector on it, drives around and illegally makes projections on buildings, including here, obviously, museum. But maybe the most spectacular, and this is kind of where I'm going to wrap up, is the group Gulf, Global Ultra Luxury Faction, a faction of Gulf labor that does direct action. And here you see us, and I was involved in this action, even though I wasn't a founder of that group. Here you see us practicing before we enter into the Guggenheim. This is at the Met Museum out back. The woman standing is actually a graduate of my social practice program. The woman in the wheelchair is not disabled. She's actually sitting on a banner. At 10 o'clock in the morning, we all entered into the Guggenheim Museum. Exactly at the right moment, she leaps off the chair and a banner is unfolded in the middle of the atrium. Immediately, security comes and they begin to tear the banner apart, while flyers come down from overhead as people drop May Day signs. This was May Day 2015, May 1st, and dollars created by Noah Fisher, artist, talking about the Guggenheim's role in the Middle East. There had been interventions before in the Guggenheim, but this time the decision was made to occupy the museum, to not leave. And so after tearing up the banner, we sat down. Outside, the Guerrilla Girls and other organizations supported our actions. Inside, a very small group of us were occupying the museum. Now, two things. One is this was the last day of the On Carrara show. So there were a couple people rehearsing a performance piece in the museum. Second thing is the museum made the decision to shut the museum down. This was not our decision. They decided they will not let anyone else in. Everybody that's in will leave when they want to, but then gradually everyone stopped coming. And we literally had the whole museum to ourselves and the security guards. I recommend it if you want to see a show, one of these blockbusters. You can't, everybody's always in the way. Of course, they called the police. We sat there, we discussed it. We wondered what would happen. They told us that they were getting a car to bring us out. The other thing is that several of us, myself included, had tickets to go to Venice, Italy the next day, to the Venice Biennale. Now, side note, Gulf Labor, not this group, Gulf, the faction, Gulf Labor had been invited by Oakley and Wesner, the curator, to be part of the Venice Biennale, a very prestigious exhibition. And we did a kind of funny little funky banner, which I'll show you in a minute, that was part of it. But we really spent money that they gave us to do research in India, in Abu Dhabi, and other places, which we can talk about. We had tickets, and we didn't want to spend the night in jail because we'd all miss our flights. This is a shot of the Biennale. Eventually, the police disappeared. And it was pretty obvious that there was no way the Guggenheim wanted to have a group of artists dragged out with handcuffs on from their museum. Right. So we all flew off, a number of us to Venice the next day, because there's also a Guggenheim in Venice. This is the piece that we had in the Arsenal, which we were obliged to create something. This was the floor plan or the basic sort of layout plan or plan of action that we created with a group that's already there called Sally Docks on Dosso d'Oro. And Sally Docks is a squatter space that's now a cultural center. And working with them, we acquired a number of small boats, and we decided we would occupy the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. Getting on the boats, going around the Grand Canal, and landing on the dock, on the loading dock, with banners and flyers. And this was the opening of the Venice Biennale, don't forget. We arrived, we captured the dock. This is the place where the really wealthy come cruising up in their water taxis to go into the museum. It also happened to be that that evening was where the United States artist was going to have the opening for their event. So they were kind of keen at some point to get rid of us. We occupied the loading dock. Eventually, this happened, and we started to get really anxious. Until you see the guy saluting us, until we realized this was an art project. Eventually, we succeeded. We convinced them that we wanted to talk to the board of directors of the Guggenheim when we got back to New York, and they let us do that. They wanted to get us out of there before the evening. We did talk to them. We had people who actually did work in the Middle East and could show them how they could create contracts that would be fair to the workers. Literally people like the International Labor Organization and Human Rights Watch spent a lot of time on this, and then they cut off all talks with us. The Illuminator went into action again, doing a number of things, shaming the Board of Trustees, actually projecting in one case on the Board of Trustees, the chairman of the board, his partner. All this is highly illegal. And that was the end of it. Partly because oil prices have dropped so precipitously. The Guggenheim is probably on hold for quite a while now. We don't know what's going to happen. But I'm just going to say, you just have to kind of be constant. You have to constantly be ready to act. Thank you. Please remember, I've got these cool flyers down here. There's not too many, so I'm at your disposal.
Hello.
I,
Thanks for a great talk. This is a pretty simple but not question, and it kind of goes across all of these projects, but in particular in the projects for the Gulf Labor Coalition. How are those actions or the production of the posters, etc., funded? Is it personally funded by the artists involved or by organizations?
that's a great question. Uh, I'll go quickly through the three collectives. PADD, 90% of it was our own labor and time. Towards the end, around 87, 80, 86, we got some funding from the NEA, which just helped produce the newsletter, but nothing else. Nobody made any salaries or money on it, so it was pretty much a gift project from everybody involved. REPOhistory was mostly the same. We did, when Giuliani tried to stop us, a number of NGOs or foundations in the U.S. gave us some funding to help make the project happen. I think people got some minor payments at that point, a few $100s or something. It was really slight. These collectives didn't last long for all kinds of reasons, which we could go into, but they tend to be kind of unstable. Gulf Labor, totally driven by our own labor. Like if the group was really active now, like whatever fee I'm getting here, am I getting a fee? Anyway, whatever fee I'm getting here, I would probably share some of it with the group, and that's how we funded it. Except when we got invited to be at the Biennale, we discovered one of the things that people don't know is that actually nobody gets paid to be in the Venice Biennale. We were kind of shocked, and the reason for that has everything to do with what's wrong with the art world, which is that most of the people in the Biennale, if not all of them, have galleries, and the galleries are supposed to be paying their artists to be there. So we were quite shocked, especially since we had met with the curator, Okwe and Wezer, a couple times and talked about what we wanted to do and given him a budget, which he had agreed to. So I think it was also a conflict between him and the Biennale itself. But we held them to it. And so myself and Andrew Ross, who's another member of the group, who's a professor at NYU and a sociologist, we just played good cop, bad cop for like months. And we managed to get the Biennale people to come up with half the money we asked for, which is, I think, $60,000. They said they would do it if we could raise the other half. And so suddenly we scrambled within like 2 weeks, and I raised almost $30,000. A big portion of it came from an NGO, which told us that we could never tell anybody who they were because they do a lot of work in that region, and that would blow their cover. So that's kind of the story of the funding. And right now we're just kind of like voluntarily fixing up the websites and that sort of thing. I'm not saying that's ideal, but that's... The money was used, by the way, to send people to Abu Dhabi and to India, where a lot of the workers come from, and we produced a book, and we produced 4 plenary sessions that took place at the Biennale. That was the real meat of what we wanted to do there, not the banner that was there. One of the things that happened, though, was several of our people, our members, when they flew over, Andrew Ross, he was told he couldn't fly when he got to JFK. When Walid Rad, who's a founding member, got to Dubai, he was told he couldn't leave the airport, and 2 other people couldn't get visas. Actually, by now, there's 5 members of Gulf Labor who basically have been banned from the United Arab Emirates. And when we asked why is this taking place, they said for security reasons. That's it. Ross, who's been active with NYU, trying to stop NYU in the region, was also tailed by a private detective. And it was very interesting. He finally found out who this person was, called the person up on the phone, was a young woman, discovered that this was her part-time job, and guess what her real vocation was? She was an artist. It's true. Yeah.
So, in relation to your like the Gulf Labor Project, do you ever find yourself questioning the value of art that's curated by these so-called museums for the 1%, like the Guggenheim or the Metropolitan in New York? Like, do you ever find yourself thinking that art is less valuable or is more compromised than underground art, art that's done by public spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's complicated. I do think we undervalue the work that's done in the street, that's done underground, that's done in public spaces. It's done by amateurs, which I tried to talk about a little, by the many, many, many people who graduate with art degrees who never really rise to visibility. I think we totally underestimate that. And I'm happy to see since the 2008 crash, a lot of artists have begun to sort of push back and create projects like Working Artists for the Greater Economy, WAGE. It's a group of young women who have kind of established the idea that if you have a not-for-profit in the United States and you get money from the state, city, whatever, the federal government, you should give a percentage of, you should say which percentage of it goes to artists, instead of putting it in your administrative fees. And you get a sticker saying I'm wage certified, right? So there's been pushback from this kind of mass of dark matter, if you will, which is great. But I wouldn't erase the value of the work that's in museums completely. I think there's a lot that can be done through the museum context as well. I mean, it would be foolish to give that theater, that sort of semiotic theater, if you will, over to those, who want to wield their own story or their own narrative. So I think you can't completely say it's one or the other. It's out of balance. It's asymmetrical at the moment. But I would say struggle on both fronts.
I just wanted to kind of thank you before my question because I was just at the Guggenheim Museum. I was in New York last week, and I think just from my background and who I am, I can see things at a very surface level and just the nice things and I guess in the wealthier perspective of everything, so I don't get to quite understand what's underneath. So, and I'm also going to Venice like in the summer, so I'm excited to see how I'm going to see that differently after hearing what you talked about. So thank you for that. But I think one question I wanted to ask was, unless these things are voiced, I wouldn't have known like what happened with the Guggenheim. So how do you personally find the things that are underground than what's presented to you, and how would you suggest that one person do that?
It's a good question too. I mean, I think the thing is, of course, we live in a time, unlike the time that I started my talk about. Like we didn't have the internet. We had like telephone trees. Oh, something's happening, call so-and-so, you call so-and-so. I mean, literally, that's how things got done, and meeting face-to-face. There was no way to instantly talk to one another vis-a-vis this kind of technology, right? So I would say use those technologies to put, Google alerts or whatever else it is on these kind of topics. Begin to explore it. It's not hard once you start scratching the surface to find this information. For example, what's been happening in Abu Dhabi has been well reported on by the Times, by the Washington Post, by LA Times, and so on and so forth. It's there. Of course, the Guggenheim would like to kind of keep it like this. The people in the Emirates would like to keep it like this. It's an amazing, you might say it is like a kind of semiotic battlefield, where various voices are constantly battling one another for visibility. But again, unlike when I was younger, you now have the ability to like intervene in a very high level. So when we called the boycott, it was actually during another arts event in the Middle East, in that same region in the Gulf, in Sharjah, which is another one of the Emirates. And so we got enormous coverage. It was in the New York Times, because here's a group of prominent artists, many of them from the Middle East, saying we're going to boycott this important museum. Getting the word out beyond the art world, that's part of what your question is. And that's why we did these actions inside the museum, and they did get covered, right? But I would say just, when you're looking at these beautiful, wonderful institutions, also look kind of under the carpet a little bit, follow the money a little bit. Who's on the board of directors? What kind of things have they really been up to? I'm not saying that all museums are nefarious and they all have, evil plans behind them. That's not the point at all. But they're all part of a system that we are all part of, which is a massive sort of capitalist global system. And we know that really, in the end, capitalism is not interested necessarily. It's not interested, I don't even say necessarily, it's not interested in the public welfare and public benefit, right? It has a goal. As Marx said, M equals C equals M. Money, commodity, money. That's what it functions. And it has to continually grow. This is an important point that David Harvey makes, that it constantly has to kind of grow and scale, right? So those are not goals necessarily that are good for the environment, that are good for labor, that are good for people. You're always going to find, I think, at some level, these high-level institutions are complicit with those problematics. And that's why you need to call them out. You can't fix everything, Like the Guggenheim is never going to be like a utopian whatever, but it could be a better place. And it could certainly have done a wonderful thing in the Middle East had they been willing to build this museum in a way that would have been like a kind of, like I said, a beacon, of fair labor. So research, use your skills you're learning here at Berkeley, do your homework.
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm really interested in thinking about the relationship between the work in the REPOhistory project and this institutional critique of the museum, because it's very clear to me how, fair labor practices are institutional critique. But I'm wondering if we do think about the architecture, if we do think about the curatorial experience, what other changes would you like to see that reflect the sort of in a sense, rehabilitation that the metal street signs provide for those same spaces to still be able to experience those anew, but to maintain that space. So, what ways do you envision a sort of reclamatory or reparative historical work in addition to the fair labor practices in museums?
Yeah, great. On the museum question, you could go back to Art Workers Coalition, which I started my talk with, and look at the demands they made. They're amazing demands. Like, there should be artists on the boards of directors, oh, that makes sense. There should be gender balance. There should be people of color that get opportunities to exhibit. That's somewhat, thank God, changed a bit over the years, but at the time there were a lot of things. It's really worth looking at. Interestingly enough, they even had this idea that museums should basically liquefy some of the assets that they had in terms of older, artists who were established and were worth a lot of money, and they could set up a fund for living artists to have Social Security. What a crazy idea. Well, it's a great idea, right? It's been privatized under the Artist Pension Trust, if you know that particular project, which is another discourse under neoliberalism, but this was a kind of utopian idea that, sell your Jackson Pollock, or maybe a minor one, whatever, set up a trust fund. Okay, lots of things we could talk about, but museums, I worked briefly in the New Museum, got fired from there, that's another story, but let me shift to the other question, which I think is really interesting in light of what's happening now with the South. I was at the University of Virginia just a few weeks ago, in the middle of the town. It's a small, mostly college town, very liberal. There's like this enormous black plastic thing because there's a statue of Lee underneath it. Every day someone comes out and tries to rip off the plastic. Every day they put it back on. It's just kind of this incredible battle. We have the battle going on in New York. A number of things which I didn't show because I just thought there was enough already. One of them being a statue to Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, president, former commissioner of police, etc., where he's sitting astride a horse. It's actually a very nicely made bronze. It's out front of the Museum of Natural History. Some of you probably have seen it. He's sitting astride a horse, about twice, not quite twice, maybe 1.5 scale. I think there's probably a term for that in monument world. Unfortunately, on the left and the right, there's figures. One is a Native American chief, and the other is probably a Maasai warrior. Don't forget, Teddy was a big game hunter, right? And, it's clear he's the great white man on the horse, looking off in the distance, and he's dressed like the Rough Rider, when he Battle of San Juan Hill and all this. The statue was put up in the 1940s. Now, this is the interesting thing. During a time after the war, towards the end of the war, when lynchings were just like running rampant across the United States. And you cannot help except realize that this kind of monument to manifest destiny is also a sign to people of color, like, okay, we're in charge, right? So there's been a targeted campaign to remove that statue, to put it in a museum. It's not like we want to blow these things up, but like put it somewhere else. Now, my good friend is now a commissioner of art in New York City. Tom Finkelpearl used to be the director of the Queens Museum. He's in the position of having to make these decisions. There's also a monument to Columbus, similar issues, a couple of others. Now, he's in the government, and it's a very liberal government, the most liberal we've ever had since I've been in New York. Nevertheless, it's a really complicated issue. If you take down those monuments, what are the consequences of that? If you put up alternative monuments, what do you decide to use? If you put up monuments maybe, or plaques, or descriptive material that questions those, how do you decide what it is? REPOhistory was a project from the bottom up. we were not sanctioned really by the government. I mean, we managed to get these permits really by hook and by crook. I mean, we really kind of did it this way, right? So we had, in a way, the latitude to choose whatever histories we want. And we're all a bunch kind of leftists of one sort or another. So the histories were about feminist. The one that Jeffrey worked on was about the first strike by women, right? All women's union. And Betty Sue's was this kind of wonderful one about the induction center, which was downtown Manhattan, where people went to the Korean War and to the Vietnam War. And all of these projects were, like, in one way or another, at specific sites, questioning the history. Personally, my idea would be you don't put up permanent signs. You could create a revolving situation where those sites are marked over and over again on some kind of schedule, producing this kind of idea that history is this palimpsest. It has many, many, many layers, particularly in a place like in New York or the Bay Area or whatever. Right? To me, that's the concept of this kind of missing archive, this kind of surplus archive of information that was suppressed in a way, particularly by the new revisionist city. And I tried to express that a little bit with the Marsha Johnson work, where there is this other city that's now completely sort of been forgotten. So I guess my sense would be, let that crypt full of these kind of overflowing with histories spill out and not try to necessarily manage it. Unfortunately, of course, if you're in the government, like Tom is, you can't do that. So, we kind of have a little bit of a difference on that. I don't know if that helps, but I think it's a question of your position. Anything local that's going on that you feel like would be worth discussing?
There's this statue down in the Civic Center that shows it's like a missionary. I forget but there's this Native American kind of in a loincloth, crouched down, and what? Yeah, kind of cowering down. Yeah, exactly. And I believe it's a missionary, and it's slated for removal. And it's the same kind of issue a little bit that you're talking about, in relation to the stuff that Tom is kind of addressing. It's like the fact that it's a monument, and a monument in a public space like the Civic Center means a particular thing, and is a particular type of government sanctioned representation of colonialization and white people's dominance over Native Americans in San Francisco context. But what do you do with the object? Like, do you destroy it as an artwork? I would say no. Do you put it in a museum? Do you put a little plaque? Like, what do you do? And it's something that the city government the city council is currently kind of struggling with a little bit. And
I think we're having the same issues. Exactly. For example, the Columbus Circle, which has it's a large pillar obelisk, and then there's a Columbus on top. The commission, which Tom put together to discuss what to do with the monument, basically realized that there's an interesting history to it, that it was at a time when it was put up at a time when Italian Americans had been attacked in the city. And they wanted to put something up to give themselves a sense of pride and a place in the city. They chose Columbus. Bad choice, okay, whatever, but we see it now. But I mean, there are these complicated notions. They're not all like that, but that one is particular.
We have another one, actually, when you mentioned Columbus. The city council in San Francisco just renamed Columbus Day.
Really?
In San Francisco.
To what?
To I think they renamed it to Indigenous Peoples Day. Okay. And so again, you have this, I mean, because there's a long tradition of Italian history in San Francisco, which is an important working class history and a maritime history. And, San Francisco used to be very strongly a maritime city. And that connection and that gentrification of that community, like the evisceration of the maritime working class Italian neighborhoods and communities in San Francisco as part of the historic gentrification of San Francisco, and now the erasure of something that was a source of pride for that working class community, because now it's just sort of thought, oh, this is an oppressive history. And so there's sort of a lack of acknowledgement of a particularly important working class and maritime history in San Francisco as seen as a progressive move.
Yeah, it really is complicated, and I mean, I have two repo, alumni here that can have their own opinions or disagree. But what I think of when I think of repo history, the project we did, it wasn't so much about trying to come up with another authoritative voice, but to sort of point to the absence itself. You have to give concrete examples, and they were temporary, but it was in a way pointing to these absences and these gaps in the city, right? The question of whether one that would then become the law, like the law that decides what the archive is about, that's, I think, a very different issue. And I wouldn't want to be in that position personally. I think it's questioning the very notion of who gets to police the archive. I think that's really what we want to be thinking about.
Questions about failure and success. So a lot of these projects that you've been involved with were not particularly successful in their outcomes. That you weren't able to transform the issues fully in the way.
Hey, I got a full-time teaching job.
And you have all these people listening to you, so that's power. But how does one think about success and failure? I mean, how, in these projects in which their outcomes are often unclear or ambiguous, like the gentrification projects or even the Abu Dhabi projects, right, where at a certain point the Guggenheim just stopped dealing with you. So, and in some ways this is an aesthetic question as well. What constitutes success, a successful work? What constitutes a work that it fails? So you must be thinking about this all the time when you're putting so much time and energy into work projects.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge debate, particularly around social practice art. I'm teaching a class now, it's called the History and Theory of Social Practice, and not everybody is doing social practice in the class, and a lot of them are just saying, well, why is this, not just like social work? You're handing out food to people, or you're doing some sort of like remedial work in the community, and they're like impossible to answer questions. I think to a certain extent that you can kind of go around and around and around. Some people who are pragmatic would say, well, it's because it's funded as art, therefore it must be art. Others would say it's social sculpture in the tradition of Beuys, that there is an aesthetic, as Grant Kester says, to the idea of dialogical sort of practices and so on and so forth. Because I think the question you're answering a little bit underneath is, do we have to measure these works by their success because they're political works? Unlike, say, looking at a painting, which we might say is successful because it's aesthetic, whatever, or in whatever terms we want to look at it that. I think that, I've always had a problem with that simple division of things. I'm not saying what you're saying is simple, but it tends to sometimes fall into this thing like, and I think that, we don't really ask Jackson Pollock is it a successful painting? Did it do the right thing? Did it change people's minds? It's a very mechanical kind of way of looking at it. But I think it's a fair question up to a point. You can't totally dodge the question. If you say, I'm doing anti-gentrification work, and in the end, of course, it's just an aesthetic gloss on what was happening. The only thing I can say is that you dive into this kind of real world, and maybe that example of Conflict Kitchen is interesting, where they created this kind of wonderful, crazy project. We're going to serve food from Korea. We're going to serve food from Iran, and so on and so forth. And it became like really popular. Like people go there because it's really good, inexpensive food. They got more and more people working there. They had to get more and more people on the staff. And then the staff themselves said, well, we need to be paid better. They had to go, they didn't actually go on strike, but they had a sort of, a deal that they cut. In other words, once you dive into the complexity of the social, let's call it, you end up getting stuck in all of those complexities as well. And maybe you don't succeed necessarily in absolute terms, but you are digging in that space in a way that you don't do when you work in a piece that's in a museum. And that just comes with the territory, so for better and for worse, I think even Adorno at one point said something like, we just shovel a lot of shit when we do critical theory. Let's face it. It's like, it's not like it's all great stuff. So I think that's part of the complexity of it. I'd like to have that conversation extended. I mean, we're trying to sort of do that with this book that we're putting out a little bit too, because it's actually got lesson plans in it. So it has this very pragmatic quality, but some of the texts in it question even the notion of social practice art itself. Like, what is that? Right?
And it also brings it back in a lot of ways to the idea of experimentation, that one is working on something, but without any guarantees of what its outcome is. But what one learns is very much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the experimental, great to see you all. Experimental aspect of it is very interesting. And I think that's a term that's kind of like lost some of its luster in the art world for various reasons. I think it kind of would be interesting. I mean, I think it's great that you're, and the series is bringing it back and exploring it again, because I think it's an important one.
Well, thanks, Greg. This has been really a wonderful
Thank
talk.
you, guys. Thank you for hanging in there. Appreciate it.